After Hanukkah, one of the most observed holidays for the entire Jewish nation is, you guessed it, Passover. And the reality is, and the beauty of the holiday of Passover, is that we tell the story. That word Haggadah, as we know, being a book, comes from the word lahagid, to connect. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually tells us that there are three different kinds of speaking and connections. There's Amira, which is like a distant form of calling out, and there's Dibor, which is maybe an attempt to try to connect, but then there's Haggadah, where my words fill your words, and where we accomplish a deeply rooted conversation held by two different individuals. Lehagid, or Gid, also means a sinu, or a connecting ligament, showing also the depth of connection that could come to be. And so as pros of the Passover Seder, we know the narratives of this week's Torah portion of Parashat Bo, where God tells Moses to go to Paro, to come to Paro, to go with God, so to speak, to Paro. Come with me as we go to Pharaoh. And one powerful thing that ends up happening is we see towards the later parts of the Torah portion that, in fact, we are commanded to tell this story, to communicate the story of the Jewish nation, to communicate the story of everything that the Jewish people had been through when it came to the Exodus, leaving a state of oppression, of servitude, of governmental powers that didn't allow us to breathe and be who we were. In fact, the Torah even calls and says that we had shortness of breath, that our stress levels were so high, that the trauma of losing loved ones over and over being difficult, and the lost legacy of Joseph and Jacob in our midst. And so, in many respects, to tell the story, who lives, who dies, who tells our story, as Hamilton tells us, ultimately, this idea of telling our story shouldn't be taken for granted. The reality is that one of the things that I often speak to is the fact that many people don't see themselves in the Jewish story. Many people don't see themselves in the Jewish narrative. Somehow that their personal experience and story isn't enough to be a part of the collective Jewish narrative. And so to have commandments, this idea that God did something for us, and we tell our children in every generation, and when they ask you, as the verse says in this week's Torah portion, when they ask you what happened, you say that this God took us from a place of servitude, that there is a force, capital letters, the universe, capital letters, something, the energy of the universe that protected us and saved us. We tell that story over and over. And the Belzer Rebbe says it's actually a miracle, being able to tell the story. I know that we say that the part of the telling the story is telling over the miracles that befell, that helped our ancestors in a time of need, but really the reality is, the Belzer Rebbe says, the miracle itself is telling the story. Myself, I'm involved in many conversations around social equity and telling stories, telling my own story and the collective story of my family, rooted in slavery in America, fighting in the American Revolutionary War. And those are Jewish stories. But sometimes our stories, when we feel like they are not Jewish enough, that our stories are not enough, that our stories have so much trauma or negativity in them that it's hard to tell those stories. Somehow the Belzer Rebbe says that actually the miracle of the Exodus is that we were still able to have a threaded, woven together narrative, whether chronological or not. We were able to compute and to tell our story to the rest of the world. So much so that nations around the world have viewed these narratives as their prime narratives for freedom, their prime narratives for liberation. And so, friends, as we celebrate this Shabbat, may we be blessed. May the mission for us this week be that we're able to communicate our stories, that we're able to thread together narratives in ourselves that sometimes feel so hard and difficult to thread together. And may we live with the legacy of the Jewish nation and of the Haggadah that we know for Passover, that we continue to recognize that there's a story to be told, that there's a legacy to uphold that rhymed, and that we together have the ability to do that. So with that, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and let us tell our stories.